Your soulmate is about to confess everything. They've waited too long to tell you this. My beloved child. Your soulmate is reaching the point where silence is no longer possible. There is something they have carried for far too long, something they almost told you more than once, only to pull the words back at the last second. But now, something has changed. They have realized that waiting any longer could cost them the one thing they were trying so desperately to protect, you. And what they are preparing to confess is not one simple feeling or one forgotten secret. It is everything. The truth about why they became distant. The reason certain conversations suddenly ended. The explanation behind those moments when their actions seemed to contradict what their heart was saying. They have been rehearsing this confession privately, trying to decide where to begin, because once the first truth comes out, several others will follow. Don't skip. There is one part of this confession they are especially afraid for you to hear. For a long time, your soulmate believed staying quiet was safer than telling you what was really happening inside them. They convinced themselves they needed more time. More certainty. A better moment. But the perfect moment never arrived, and their silence slowly became its own kind of decision. What you may not know is that there was a specific moment when they nearly told you everything. They had the words ready. They imagined your reaction. They even prepared themselves for the possibility that you might walk away. Then fear took over. They wondered whether you would see them differently once you knew how deeply this connection had affected them. So they buried the confession again. But that choice has haunted them, because something happened afterward that made them realize you may have interpreted their silence completely differently. You may have thought they didn't care enough, when the truth was almost the opposite. And now they know that misunderstanding cannot be allowed to remain between you. Here is where everything begins to shift. Your soulmate is no longer asking themselves whether they should confess. They are asking how soon they can finally do it. They have reached a point where protecting themselves feels less important than making sure you know the truth. Stay till the end, because the confession goes deeper than simply saying, "I still care about you." They want to explain a decision they made without telling you, a decision that quietly influenced what happened between you afterward. They believed they were doing the right thing at the time, but now they understand that keeping you outside the decision may have created the very distance they feared. And there is another detail they have never admitted to anyone clearly. Even during the periods when they appeared to be moving forward, part of them was still measuring every possibility against you. That is why this confession feels so dangerous to them. Once they tell you everything, they cannot hide behind timing, confusion, or silence anymore. But the biggest truth is still waiting, and it begins with what they were actually afraid would happen if you discovered how long they had been choosing you in secret. The truth they have been avoiding begins with a choice you never knew they made. At a moment when your soulmate could have taken their life in a completely different direction, they stopped because of you. They never told you that. They never wanted you to feel responsible for what they chose, and they were terrified that admitting it would sound like pressure rather than love. So when an opportunity appeared that could have created even more distance between you, they quietly stepped away from it. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Inside, however, they were making a decision that would follow them for much longer than they expected. And here is the part that unsettles them now. You may have spent all this time believing they were uncertain about you, while they were secretly rearranging pieces of their future because they couldn't imagine completely closing the door on what existed between you. Something huge is waiting for you, because that was only the first thing they hid. There was another reason they stayed silent, and this one is harder for them to admit. Your soulmate was afraid that if they showed you exactly how much you mattered, they would lose control of the situation. They had built an image of themselves as someone who could handle distance, uncertainty, and unanswered feelings. But privately, certain reminders of you broke through that image every time. A familiar phrase. A memory they thought they had moved beyond. Even an ordinary moment could suddenly bring back something you once said, and they would find themselves wondering whether you still thought about them too. That is when they began writing down things they wished they could tell you. Not dramatic declarations. Real things. Apologies. Questions. Memories. Explanations they should have given much earlier. And among those words was one confession they kept rewriting because no version felt safe enough to send. They knew that if you ever read it, you would finally understand why their behavior had seemed so confusing. But recently, something happened that made hiding those words feel more dangerous than revealing them. Your soulmate realized that time was not protecting this connection, it was slowly changing it. They began wondering whether you had finally stopped waiting for an explanation. Whether someone else might eventually give you the honesty they had been too afraid to offer. That possibility struck them harder than they expected. Suddenly, all those reasons for staying quiet started sounding like excuses. They could see how their silence might have hurt you, and for the first time, they understood that confessing everything wasn't only about relieving their own heart. You deserved to know what was real. So they made a private decision: when the opportunity comes, they will not give you half the story anymore. They will tell you what they chose, what they regretted, and what they still feel. But before they can say the words they have rehearsed for so long, there is one painful truth they must admit first, something they did after convincing themselves that you might never choose them back. What they did next was not meant to erase you, it was meant to prove to themselves that they could live without waiting for you. Your soulmate tried to become emotionally unavailable to the possibility of what the two of you could be. They filled their days, avoided certain memories, and even convinced themselves that closing this chapter was the mature thing to do. For a while, they almost believed it. But there was one problem. Every time they imagined their future becoming permanent without you somewhere in it, something felt unfinished. That realization frightened them because it exposed the truth they had worked so hard to bury. Distance had changed their behavior, but it had never completely changed their heart. And now they must confess something even more uncomfortable. During that period, they made a choice based on the assumption that you had already stopped caring, and that assumption may have been completely wrong. They had interpreted your silence through their own fear. Every delayed conversation became evidence. Every moment of uncertainty seemed like confirmation that you were letting go. Instead of asking you directly, your soulmate created answers in their own mind, and those answers shaped decisions you knew nothing about. But recently, they began looking back at those moments differently. What if you weren't rejecting them? What if you were protecting yourself because their mixed signals had made you unsure too? That question changed everything. Suddenly, they could see the connection from your side, and what they saw was painful. You may have been waiting for clarity while they were waiting for reassurance. You may have needed honesty while they were offering distance. Two people could have been standing on opposite sides of the same misunderstanding, each expecting the other to move first. Don't skip, because realizing this is exactly what pushed your soulmate toward the confession they had postponed for so long. Now their confession has changed from something carefully controlled into something much more vulnerable. They no longer want to tell you only the parts that make them look strong. They want to admit where they were wrong. They want you to know that some of their distance came from fear, not indifference, and that certain decisions were made because they thought losing you had already happened. Most importantly, they are preparing to answer the question they suspect you have carried quietly. If I mattered this much, why didn't you simply tell me? They know there is no perfect answer. They waited too long. They allowed fear to speak where honesty should have spoken. And they understand that confession cannot guarantee your response. But there is one thing they refuse to hide anymore. Before they disappeared behind all that uncertainty, there was a specific moment when they almost chose complete honesty with you, and someone said something that convinced them to remain silent. What your soulmate heard that day became the reason they waited this long, and they are finally ready to tell you exactly what it was. The words they heard that day were simple, but they landed exactly where your soulmate was most vulnerable. If they really feel the same way, you won't have to risk everything to find out. At first, that sounded reasonable. Almost comforting. Someone they trusted had unknowingly given their fear a perfect excuse to wait. So instead of telling you what was in their heart, your soulmate began watching for proof from you. They noticed every small gesture, every conversation, every moment when you seemed close, and then questioned all of it. Was that warmth real, or were they imagining it? Did you miss them, or were you simply being kind? The more they searched for certainty, the more uncertain they became. What they didn't understand was that you may have been doing the exact same thing, reading their hesitation as a sign to protect your own heart. That one piece of advice didn't create their feelings, but it gave their fear somewhere to hide. And eventually, waiting became easier than risking the answer. But something recently forced them to see how dangerous that waiting had become. Your soulmate found themselves revisiting an old conversation between you, remembering one detail they had dismissed at the time. You had said something that, looking back now, sounded less like casual conversation and more like an opening. A chance. Perhaps even an invitation for them to be honest. Back then, fear made them overlook it. Now they cannot stop thinking about it. What if that was the moment you were quietly asking them to step closer? What if you had offered them exactly the reassurance they claimed they needed, and they were simply too frightened to recognize it? That realization has been sitting heavily with them because it changes the story they told themselves for so long. Maybe you didn't close the door. Maybe they stood in front of an open door and convinced themselves it was locked. And if that is true, their confession must include an apology they never expected to make. They are preparing to admit that you were not the only person who misunderstood what happened between you. They misunderstood you too. They projected their fear onto your actions, then reacted to conclusions they had never actually confirmed. And now, instead of defending those choices, they want to take responsibility for them. This is why their confession is becoming bigger than, "I have feelings for you." They need to tell you where those feelings led them, what they almost sacrificed because of fear, and why they kept returning emotionally even after convincing themselves it was over. Stay till the end, because there is still one secret underneath everything else. Your soulmate has kept something connected to you all this time, something they could have thrown away, deleted, or forgotten, but deliberately chose not to. They have returned to it during moments when missing you became impossible to ignore. And when they finally confess everything, they are considering showing it to you, because what they kept may reveal more about their true feelings than anything they could possibly say. What they kept was never valuable because of what it cost, it was valuable because of what it represented. It could be an old message, a photograph, a note, or some small reminder connected to a moment between you that seemed ordinary when it happened. Your soulmate had countless opportunities to let it disappear, especially during the times they were trying hardest to convince themselves they had moved on. But every time they came close, they stopped. Something about that reminder brought them back to the version of themselves that existed before fear complicated everything. And there is one detail they have never admitted: on some of their loneliest nights, they return to it just to remember how genuine the connection once felt. Not because they wanted to live in the past, but because they needed to know they had not imagined everything. That small reminder became evidence that something real had existed, and perhaps still did. Then came the realization they could no longer ignore. Keeping that reminder while pretending you no longer mattered was a contradiction. Your soulmate finally saw that they had spent too much energy trying to escape a truth their own actions kept revealing. They could avoid conversations. They could stay busy. They could tell themselves that enough time had passed. But they could not explain why your name still carried emotional weight, or why the possibility of never telling you the truth felt increasingly unbearable. That is when they began imagining the confession differently. Instead of rehearsing the perfect words, they started thinking about the honest ones. I was scared. I misunderstood you. I waited because I thought silence would protect me. And then the hardest admission of all: I knew there was something important between us, but I was afraid to discover whether you knew it too. Those words frighten them because there is nowhere to hide once they are spoken. Yet there is something else you need to know before that confession reaches its deepest point. Your soulmate is not expecting a magical answer from you. They understand that waiting this long has consequences, and they know you may have questions they cannot answer comfortably. That is precisely why they are preparing to stop controlling the outcome. For once, they want to give you the entire truth and allow you to decide what it means. Don't skip, because one final layer has begun pushing them toward that moment faster than anything before. They recently imagined what would happen if they stayed silent and discovered, months from now, that the chance was permanently gone. The thought did not bring relief. It brought regret. And in that instant, they understood what they feared more than rejection, never knowing what might have happened if they had finally been brave enough to tell you everything. But there is one confession buried beneath even that fear, a promise they once made to themselves about you, and breaking that promise is exactly what they are considering now. The promise they made to themselves was that they would never reach out unless they were absolutely certain you still wanted them in your life. It sounded protective at the time. They told themselves they were respecting your space, avoiding another misunderstanding, and preventing both of you from reopening something that might only hurt again. But underneath that promise was the same fear that had controlled them from the beginning. They wanted certainty before vulnerability. They wanted proof before honesty. And now they finally understand the impossible trap they created. How could you ever know what they truly felt if they refused to speak until you somehow proved you already knew? That realization has shattered the logic they depended on for so long. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that confession requires risk. There may never be a perfect sign, perfect moment, or guaranteed response. Sometimes the truth simply has to be spoken before time makes the decision for you. That is why they are considering breaking their own promise. Not recklessly. Not to pressure you into anything. They simply cannot keep pretending silence is the kinder choice when silence is exactly what created so much confusion. And they have been thinking carefully about the first thing they want to say when that moment finally arrives. Surprisingly, it is not, "I love you." It is not some dramatic declaration designed to overwhelm you. The first words they want to give you are an apology. They want to acknowledge that you deserved clarity much earlier. They want to explain that their distance was never meant to make you question your worth or wonder whether the connection mattered. Then they want to tell you what happened behind that distance, the choices, the fear, the conversations, and every moment they almost came back with the truth. Something huge is waiting for you, because once that apology is spoken, there is one question they desperately need to ask. And that question has nothing to do with whether you waited for them. They know they have no right to expect that. What they need to know is whether there is still enough trust between you for one completely honest conversation. No guessing. No hidden meanings. No disappearing behind pride when the emotions become uncomfortable. Just the truth, finally placed where both of you can see it. Your soulmate has imagined many possible answers, including the one they fear most, but even that no longer feels worse than carrying these unspoken words indefinitely. They have waited too long already, and they know it. Yet before they can ask you for that conversation, they must reveal the one thing they have protected more carefully than every other secret, the real reason losing you frightened them so deeply in the first place. It reaches further back than you realize, to a moment between you that changed what they believed was possible. And once you understand what happened in that moment, everything they have done since may finally make sense. That moment was quieter than you might expect, and that is exactly why it stayed with them. There was no dramatic declaration, no perfect setting, no obvious sign that something life-changing had happened. It was simply a moment when your soulmate felt completely understood by you. Maybe you listened when everyone else rushed to judge. Maybe you noticed something they were trying to hide behind a smile. Maybe you remembered a small detail they assumed everyone would forget. Whatever happened, it touched a part of them they had spent years protecting. For one brief moment, they did not feel like they had to perform, explain, or prove themselves. They could simply be seen. That frightened them almost as much as it comforted them, because once they knew what that kind of connection felt like, losing it became a possibility they could no longer dismiss. And suddenly, their years of hesitation begin to make sense for a reason they never wanted to admit. Your soulmate was not only afraid you would reject their feelings. They were afraid that confessing them could destroy the one connection that had made them feel safe enough to be fully themselves. So they chose silence, believing it preserved something precious. But now they understand the painful irony: silence did not preserve the connection. It filled it with unanswered chew.